Yeah, so we're gonna talk about some of the things that we've been discussing already remotely. So African American English, English in Puerto Rico, and Mona's talk on English as a foreign language. So some of the important concepts for these three themes that we've been discussing, or side themes of world Englishes, is the notion of standardization, no? And standard language ideologies, and how these standard language ideologies problematize the development of teaching materials for English, like that's Mona's talk, or it also problematizes, or it places in a disadvantage ethnic minorities, such as African American English, and also second language learners of English, because we have these prevalent standard language ideologies that exist that influence the way that people will think and the way that people perceive of English as a fixed language that exists objectively. And they don't really think about the variation, inherent variation within every single language that has different dialects. So yeah, so we're going to talk about standard language ideologies, standardization, and just some key definitions for that. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about concepts in relation to English as a lingua franca. All right, so can you see my handout?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. All right, so what is the standard dialect? We've been talking about this over and over again, and we've been referring to it as the language that is codified, the language that is represented across different domains and across different text-based means. So sadly, this presentation was lost. All I have left of it is this handout, so bear with me. So what is the standard dialect? Global Englishes today cannot be divorced from their social and political context. So whenever we look at any English, whether we're talking about standard English, whether we're talking about ethnic varieties like African American English or Puerto Rican English, we always have to look at language in context. We can't look at language as this homogeneous entity that exists in our brain, that it's an objective fact that we're born with, y lo tenemos genéticamente, and it doesn't change. And essentially, we can't divorce it from the social and historical movements that led to the creation of a language. So especially events that led to the global status of English cannot be seen or taken as facts. So we can't just say, but English is the language of the majority or whatever, it's the most spoken second language because that's just the way it is, or, that's the way that things have always been. So events need to be socially and critically problematized. And the thing is that, when we grow up and when we go to school and we're all subject to the same English classes, dicen, ¿qué nos dicen? Aprender inglés es importante. Why? Why do they tell you English is important? What have been your experiences in school? Anyone?
They just said that it gave us more opportunities, like in life, like job opportunities or study.
Right. So they tell you that that it'll help you get jobs, higher paying jobs, or irte para Estados Unidos, go to the US. And they just say that that's just the way that things are. O sea, people always repeat the same thing. It's important that you learn English, right? But no one ever says necessarily why it is the way that it is. Maybe, the immediate why es porque somos parte de los Estados Unidos, we're part of the US, whatever. But, we don't really ask a why, right? So standard language or language standards, which are the rules that we have for any language, are topics that excite an immense amount of controversy, both inside and outside of linguistics. So this goes in hand with, you know, how the same way that English's global status is never questioned as to why or how it came to be that way, the rules behind English are also never questioned. So people are like, well, that's just how you say it. That's the word order. That's how most people speak it. That's what is correct. But again, not many people challenge it. So what is the standard dialect? A standard language is the use for the variety of a language that is considered the norm. So usually when we, in society, when we perceive English, there's an identifiable object English that we think of. English se habla así o asá, with a bunch of rules, a bunch of spellings, and you know, it has its own set, its own system, right? So we see it as the norm. So the optimum for education purposes is the standard language. So this idea that all of us have is also what is introduced by education. It's the yardstick that everybody measures their own capabilities of English by. So, you know, we enter school and we decide that we're going to judge ourselves and our competence in English with regards to the grammar rules or how we hear people in America sound. Como que, oh, I'm a bit conscious about my pronunciation because it's not like the pronunciation of standard English. It's not the pronunciation that I hear government officials or celebrity figures, right? So we treat it like this objective fact que existe, that cannot be tarnished. So it's a prestigious variety, the standard language variety, because it's developed by people in power, scholars, educators, so people that have high advanced degrees, right? And it's also often spoken by people with advanced degrees in other professions or people in the higher end of the socioeconomic scale, right? So like lawyers, doctors, politicians, and because, you know, these people have access to that higher education or that advanced degree, then it's then attached to prestige, right? So the way that a language is attached to meaning is usually according to who speaks that language. So a language ideology about any language is ultimately an ideology of the people who speak that language. So in this sense, the standard English is seen as prestigious because we think of people that are in power who speak it. So a prestige variety is a standard language that is spoken by a minority of people within a society, typically by those in power. Again, these are just definitions. Standard language is a language that's considered the norm, that goes unquestioned as this is the representation of English, y el que se enseña en la escuela, and we see it as like the norm, even though it's not necessarily the case. And the prestigious variety is usually the standard. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. If you have any questions, you can ask me and I can explain in different words. Or any comments. All right. So varieties, variedades of language do not actually have prestige themselves. So it's not that you naturally or organically a way of speaking is more prestigious than another. These varieties acquire prestige when their speakers have high prestige. So they become attached to this meaning of prestige according to the people who speak it. No es que necesariamente it is the best, or it is the nicest sounding, or it is the most logical. It's because of the people who speak it. So we can't really treat standard as a fact that it's automatically correct. And one of the problems with the word correct, that a lot of linguists never use the word correct, because correct kind of has cognitive implications. Muchas personas, a lot of people think that, when we say the word correct, then it means that this person is then linguistically competent. They have the ability, the proficiency in their minds, right? Their minds are functioning well so that they know how to use the language system correctly or accordingly, right? So it's a bit of a disparaging term. So, and especially because of what we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, what goes into standardizing and codifying a language, the demographic factor. I don't know if you remember the criteria. We said demographic factor, the spread, like how many people speak it, and who speaks it, the representation. So we really need to perhaps be more, obviously we have to abide by the standard because we live in the real world, and in the real world there are a lot of inequalities, and language is just one of the places where inequalities exist. But we should also perhaps be more welcoming to other different ways of speaking. So what is a standard dialect? Jenkins differentiates between standard language and language standards. Son dos términos, two concepts. So standard language is the one that we've been talking so far, the prestigious variety, the one spoken by people in positions of power, the one that's imposed to us through education. But language standards, the reverse, so the word order changes. Language standards refers to las reglas, the rules. Okay, so the prescriptive language rules, which together constitute the standard, and to which all members of a language community are explored and urged to conform during education, regardless of the local dialect. Okay, so standard dialect is the prestigious dialect spoken and developed by people in power, and everybody has to abide by it, and people see it as this fact. And we use it as a benchmark, right? And a standard language has language standards. The order flips, right? So language standards are the rules that we need to learn or abide by in order to speak the standard language, okay? So language standards, it's important to know that they change over time because language is not static. The same way that people are not static, history is not static, and we have new developments coming in and new societal events that are affecting the way that we communicate. Also, language standards evolve and they try to keep up with the changing society or the changing prestigious norm. So what was prestigious like a century ago in Spanish is not necessarily what's prestigious in Spanish today, right? And the same goes with English, all right? So language standards also change to reflect the most recent prestigious developments. So during early stages of transition, a change might be perceived as an error, particularly by defenders of standard language ideologies. So again, as I said before, what was prestigious like a century ago is not prestigious necessarily today, but in the process of language being codified and standardized, at some point, perhaps changes in language are first perceived as incorrect. Como que, ¿qué es esto? Like, esta ridícula, nobody says that, or this is incorrect. For instance, I suppose one of the most contemporary examples es el idioma inclusivo, el lenguaje inclusivo en español, ¿no? Inclusive language in Spanish. So we have these people appropriating orthographic means like X and E y otra letra del alphabet, other letters of the alphabet. They're appropriating it to Spanish so that Spanish, which is usually which is historically a gendered language that makes use of gendered morphological endings to give some kind of gender to anything. Well, people, in order to be more inclusive in a contemporary society that defends different gender identities and defends the right of people to love who they love, right? So in a contemporary society that, you know, where we live, people have tried to appropriate the ideologies of today's societies into the way that we communicate, into the Spanish language system. So how can we make language mimic the state of the world that we are right now? So a lot of scholars, a lot of academics, you see them writing with the inclusive X or the E. So they're paving the path or leading the way in appropriating these inclusive orthographical methods, so that maybe in a couple of years' time, who knows, this will eventually become the norm. And maybe eventually in all pieces of writing and in science, you'll see more inclusive X's or E's, all right? But however, during early stages of this transition of something becoming like a form, an innovative form, into something becoming standard or a language standard, usually it faces a lot of criticism and people that are outraged. Está ridiculé, no hace sentido, X no es parte, it's not part of the Spanish phonological system where it occurs. It doesn't make any sense. People are not going to be able to read that. It's silly, right? So you do have people that are against idioma inclusivo in Spanish, and they are scholars, but then you also have scholars that are for it. And society also has dividing ideas about it, right? So in this path to standardization, if it achieves widespread acceptance, usually it's perceived as an error or it's challenged by people, because people have intimate ties to language, because we're born with language, right? From the moment that we come into this world, we hear our mother tongue and we get used to the way that things are or how we hear things. So we have intimate ties and intimate beliefs with our language. So we can be quite possessive about it and want to maintain it, no? So everybody has their own way of maintaining language or defending their language. So it's quite common that, you know, these language ideologies of, oh, it's an error, happen whenever language standards are changing through time. All right. And the people who usually develop the language standards are dictionary makers, como la Real Academia Española in this case. But, you know, we also have language standards changing in English. For instance, a couple of years ago, also for us to be inclusive in English, Oxford English Dictionary said, instead of saying he and she, or he or she, or, o sea, all the different ways of saying she, así como paréntesis, NS and he, we're gonna say they to talk about he and she. It's gonna be a language standard to use they, or it's gonna be acceptable to use they to be inclusive. So in that sense, you know, Oxford English Dictionary also made that move to reflect society and gender equality and all of these different things that have been happening around the world in modern day history. So gender equality and gender identity are central themes to today's society that impacts language planning and policy and dictionary makers. So what is a standard dialect? Language standards, i.e. the rules, do not seem to function in the interest of certain groups. So while maybe in the examples that we're using, it's language standards are changing perhaps towards a more positive light to reflect diversity and gender identity, but it's not always the case that language standards move to include people. Usually language standards or rules are exclusive. because they always end up excluding one group or one minority. So some scholars argue that standards should be made more inclusive. So for instance, language standards in English, as we saw in the movie Talking Black in America, language standards exclude African American English. They treat it as incorrectly. Then people's journey in school is usually tarnished with a lot of linguistic discrimination, or teachers telling their students that they're speaking incorrectly, or students being judged as unintelligent based on how they speak differently, not, following the white-based language standard in the US. So usually, well, it's for certain groups, and in the US, that seems to be the white majority. And then, then you have scholars like the scholars in the movie that advocate for the teaching of Ebonics, or African American English in school. Therefore, in some way advocating that standards, or what we teach, be more inclusive. You remember that part of the film, right? ¿Sí? ¿Están ahí? Sí, Daphne, muy bien. Pero no me dejen ahí hablando yo sola. All right, but again, this is quite relevant for you and I and for everybody, because language is a part of everyday life. So creating a standard, or the process of standardization, can be seen as quite abnormal and an artificial process. Why? Artificial in relation to natural processes of linguistic evolution and language change. Because I suppose it's artificial because it doesn't always reflect the diversity of language. It reflects certain linguistic forms, certain ways of speaking, but not everyone. So in this case, we know that whenever we read something like a book or a newspaper article, we know that it's written in a different register than how people use language in everyday spoken interaction. So in this sense, we perhaps see standard language, which primarily exists in writing, we see it as artificial. So there's 4 stages of standardization, or making a language standard. So the first is selection. And we've spoken about this as well a couple of weeks ago. The 4 stages: selection, codification, elaboration of function, and acceptance. So let's review some of these 4 processes: selección, codificación, elaboración y aceptar. Vamos. Selection, codification, elaboration of function, acceptance. So I'm gonna bring you guys to this link. It's an interactive link. Before we dive into this discussion, that talks about how words get standardized or codified in a dictionary. It's from Oxford English Dictionary. So please have a look at the chat. I've shared with you this link of standardization for words. Okay, I'm gonna give you 5 minutes to have a look at this. It should look like this. Mhm. So let me know when you're done. You can write it in the chat. Is everyone else done? All right, so what did you learn? Who wants to talk about the link?
How a word like, oh my god, just spread out of control in such a fast and out of nowhere context where the word was not a thing before, and after got just so much people using it, just people look at it and it's like, oh yeah, this is a word, now.
So about the spread, the historical spread of a word across people and domains, channels. Anyone else want to talk about what you learned?
I found it particularly interesting. I mean, other than the fact that it was used in like so long ago, like you would have thought that this word was like very new, but it was used in such an interesting way by such an important person. But I found it really interesting the way people at the Oxford English Dictionary search and research um, words that are suggested by the general public in order for them to uh, be standardized in a way.
Yeah, I like that too. I think that that's one of the so dictionary makers do this a lot. They pay attention to society and they try to keep up with societal changes or societal uses of language because they don't want to be outdated. They want to be relevant. They want, people to see them as this like super updated tool that's a reflection of language right now, right? But at the same time, they're also conservative because they also have to maintain, they're innovative within a certain extent. But Oxford English dictionaries, as a linguistic tool, I find them to be a little bit more liberal than el RAE, even though, a little bit more liberal because their online dictionary, they essentially make it like this encyclopedia of words. So if you go to maybe, we don't have access, sadly, in this institution, la UPRM doesn't have access to this Oxford English Dictionary. I used to have access to it through another institution, a European institution. But when you have access to this online dictionary, literally it gives you chronologically the developments of that word. desde el principio, from the very first instance where it was found, or where we have documentation of it. And it gives you the context of the sentence where it occurred, and also what it meant for that time. Okay. So yeah, it's quite a very unique tool, the OED, Oxford English Dictionaries. It's really good. But as Gabriela questioned, not all dictionaries work this way. No, not all dictionaries work that way. But La RAE actually has different tools. So La RAE has their standard Spanish dictionary, but they also have an academy for Puerto Rican Spanish, but they're known to be a bit more hesitant to embracing change. But yeah, Gabriela says not all dictionaries work this way because the linguist from what I should have included inclusive language already. There's enough evidence for it to be well, the thing is, Gabriela, that a lot of people are still on the fence about that, and a lot of people don't agree with it. For instance, I've read work by linguists who believe that the use of X is not good in Spanish because where it's found between consonants, and you can't read that out loud. And the whole point of having an orthographic system or an alphabet system is that people can also have an idea how to pronounce something. And a lot of people argue, or some people argue, that the X sort of goes against or doesn't take into consideration the rules of Spanish sounds or of Spanish phonology. O sea, what letters we find in Spanish that occur next to each other. So for instance, it would make more sense in this argument to use the I, la E, as inclusive rather than the X, because the X, you wouldn't be able to read that out loud. And some people think that it would end up making it harder for people that don't speak Spanish or are learning to speak Spanish to understand how to pronounce certain words because of the X. And that's the argument anyway. But yeah, so this process of codification, Amanda says, I agree. I have opinions about it, and I think some of you know my opinions about it, but I'm not gonna share. Pero yeah, so when it comes to codification and selecting, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. You have to take into consideration how many people are using it, the spread, right? So for instance, in that link that I gave you, the OED doesn't just look at that one instance where it occurred con ese tipo random, but it was like over time, the accumulation of, oh my God, over time through different means. So this guy, and then we have other instances or recordings of it in newspapers, in teen magazines, online, like everywhere, right? So because it occurs in different channels, different domains by different people, then it gets noticed or selected, right? Because it has power, it has spread. So it gets selected, it gets codified into the dictionary, right? And then maybe they also talk about an elaboration of function, because once something is codified, then other people learn about it. And then maybe we find, oh my God, in other instances. So maybe, oh my God, used to be just a matter of expressing emotions verbally, but then we now see it in other ways. It's used as well. Like, oh my God, it could be used in other ways. So then it gets elaborated and accepted perhaps as part of the standard language. Now, oh my God isn't accepted necessarily as part of standard English. We see it as non-standard. So in this case, well, oh my God is part of the informal English language way of speaking, no? Oh my God is a form of expression used in informal language. But other examples of words being selected, codified, elaborated, and accepted into as standards would be perhaps not, oh my God is not a very good example of acceptance into standard language. But for instance, there's certain words that have changed in meaning. Por ejemplo, la palabra dumb. At some point it was selected, codified, elaborated for function and accepted, whatever, right? So it's not that these processes are fixed, but déjame ver cómo explico eso. Porque, oh my God, is codified into the dictionary, but it's not accepted as part of standard English. But this is specifically for parts of English that are standardized, such that not only are they codified, but also accepted as part of formal English or standard English that's taught in schools. Tratando de pensar, how can I, what example can I use for this that's not? Oh my God is accepted as part of English, but it's more informal. Perhaps, oh my gosh, and the reason why it's seen as more informal is because it's taking God's name in vain, no? So, oh my gosh would be a more acceptable version for people who are religiously inclined, or oh my, right? Oh my, maybe you find it more. Lisa says, do you think social media will become the main channel where OED would turn to for confirmation of the use of the word? Because right now, I think social media like Twitter, TikTok have influenced language a lot over the. Yes, certainly social media has introduced so many words into the dictionary. So Oxford Dictionary has entries for YOLO, has entries for LOL, LOL, and actually LOL is quite old. LOL, I think it's like over 20 years old. There's a link about LOL being over 20 years old. I don't know if it's like 25 or 30 right now, but you know, they get accepted, but it doesn't mean accepted into the dictionary. And I would argue, you know, Hudson suggests that these are the processes: selection, codification, elaboration, and acceptance. But we don't always see these happening for every word or for every structure. This, you know, happens a bit variably, especially today in an era of social media influencing the way that we speak. But more or less, I suppose what Hudson was trying to get at is that it's a process. You know, the fact that a language form gets accepted is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. And again, Hudson was writing in the 90s. So in the 90s, you know, the computer was being used, but it was before like the internet boom, social media technology. So it was perhaps processes of standardization back then were perhaps more static, more fixed, more, okay, step by step, I was thinking of a word. But right now, you know, it's still like this. It's still a process, as is everything with institutions. But we know that people are paying more attention to the way that language is used online, because more and more, most of our interactions are taking place online, especially in a world of social distancing. So definitely social media is transforming our language, and it could be included in certain dictionaries. But again, the process of being included and accepted, codified to acceptance, can take a while, can take a couple of years, right? Can take a couple of years. And firstly, a lot of people feeling outraged at a certain way of speaking as incorrect or informal, until finally it gets included as standard dialect. But it is a process nonetheless. So different definitions. The notion of what counts as a standard dialect has taken different interpretations throughout the years. So in pages 24 to 25, Jenkins enumerates some of these definitions. So people have different ways of referring to standard language. Some people have said that standard language is the language spoken by the educated, used in schools, universities, and institutions. Actually, most people would say it's the language of education. Other people also talk about standard dialects as seen in writing. So it's codified in the dictionaries, right? So again, used by the educated. They also define it as mostly in terms of grammar and word choice, but not pronunciation. And this is because standard language is an artificial codified variety. So it was developed by grammarians, by educators, by linguists, by language experts. These are the rules of English. These are the rules of Spanish, right? So they try to generalize the most prestigious forms of English, but usually, the best way to define standard English is that it exists in writing, it's used in schools, but not pronunciation. Why not pronunciation? Because everybody has different ways of pronouncing things. There's different regional dialects of pronunciation. So we can talk about it in terms of also vocabulary and structure. So it has specific vocabulary, specific structure, and it's traditionally spoken by middle or upper classes and the educated speaker, so the elite. So again, it's standard dialect is tied to eliteness. Education, it's written, so you have to be literate. It's about grammar and words, and it's about class, right? So these are some of the ways that a standard dialect has been characterized in the literature. Also, number 5, it is not the whole of English, but only a part. So when you learn English in school or in a book, you're only learning a part of English. You're not learning all of it. And this is evident, especially once you go to, you go for the first time to the United States visiting, and maybe people tell you something in a construction that you've never heard before, in a sentence structure that you've never heard before. They never taught you that sentence structure, or maybe they tell you a word that you've never heard before and you haven't found it in any of your English books. So then you're like, what are you saying, right? Because you were schooled or you were taught standard English. You weren't taught the English of that place or of that community. So it's important that when you look at books that, are taught in school, whatever, that it's not the whole picture of English, but only a part, and it is artificial. It is set by those in power. So in order for it to be self-explanatory, it ought to be called the grammar and core vocabulary of educated usage in English. So it exists in education. Number 6, as a minority variety. So some people would say that standard English is a minority variety in the sense that it's based on the elite. It's based on the educated. So it's a minority variety that possesses a lot of prestige and is widely understood. We're using the word minority not to say that few people speak it, because we're saying that it's widely understood, but we're saying it's a minority variety in that it is based on the minority prestigious elite, okay? But it is widely understood. Why? Because the elite have power, the elite have representation, and they can codify the way that they speak and then sell those books or textbooks into other people that are trying to learn English. So their way of speaking becomes more and more powerful. Number 7, it's not limited to one accent. So yes, we can talk about different accents of standard English. We can have standard English in New York, standard English in California, right? So it's not to do with pronunciation, but through history, it's associated with different variations. So the same way as well in Britain, it's not about one accent. We can talk about the Queen's English, the King's English, Oxford English, BBC English, and all of these different Englishes that we're talking about all point to standard English in the UK. Number 8, the kind of English in which all native speakers learn to read and write, although most do not actually speak it. So we all learn how to write in standard English in school. Whether we succeed o se nos hace difícil, pues whatever. But we all learn to read and write in standard English. However, whether we actually engage in standard English in everyday life, when we choose to talk in English, Well, that's a little bit different. So, you know, maybe some of you have used the example of Donald Trump in your assignments. So maybe Donald Trump doesn't speak standard English when he talks to his audiences, but maybe when he writes an email, he does. We don't know. We know that in Twitter, he still doesn't speak standard English, but maybe there's another version of him that writes in standard English, even though he doesn't speak it. So, you know, that's just an example that you may be literate in standard English, or you may understand it, but you don't necessarily have to engage in it. All right, so that's it for today. I'm gonna read this last bit and then I'll send you off. So there are similarities across standard English definitions. So standard English is best defined by vocabulary and grammar, and not by pronunciation, because when we try to define something by pronunciation, we're going to run across many different exceptions, many different groups that don't fit the ideal. So it's best to just stick to words and sentence structure. All right, so that's it for today. We meet on Wednesday again. I don't know if it's going to be online or presencial. It's a good question. I'm gonna see what happens to developments with regards to the gates. So if the gates are open by Wednesday, then I will meet the Wednesday group and I will record myself talking to the Wednesday group for the Monday group. I bought a recording device, so this could happen. I can do this now. But if the gates are closed, then we do this again, all of us, okay? And I also wanted to say that, as some of you may have noticed, some of your grades are being uploaded slowly but surely. I had hoped that I would have gotten all of this done over the weekend, but with things online, everything gets complicated. But what I want to know is that if you're able to see your grades all right when the grades are input into the system, because since the platform for your midterm was Turn It In, you know, that's where the grades are being changed and also your feedback, but I'm not sure whether you're able to see the feedback in your exams. So I want to know whether you are, and if you're not, then I would probably send individually then your feedback through email. But I guess that's a question I have for some of you, those of you who have received your midterm grade, because every midterm has had its own customized feedback, but I don't know if it's getting to you. Can you see the feedback?
I could see the note, but I saw the grade, but I can't see the feedback.
You can't?
Yeah, I can't see it either. It gets all messed up. I don't know. It looks weird. So I can't really see I can't even see the grade itself. It's all like, todas las palabras se ven como que una encima de la otra. I don't know.
That's weird. All right, so probably what I'm gonna do is download the feedback and then send it individually if anyone wants to know why you got what you got. But if you're like happy with that, then I suppose, you know, the other thing would be if we're presencial, then I could show you your feedback. It all depends. But yes, so if you have any questions, you've received your grade, you have any questions as to why you got what you got, send me an email and I'll show you your personalized feedback, because all of you have personalized feedbacks. Those of you that have been graded already. Lisette?
She